Right. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Influence Global podcast. And I'm delighted to have with me Martin Jaskolowski. Is that right, Martin? Have I got that right?
Yes, yeah. That's right. Yeah, correct.
It's taken a couple of attempts, everybody, to get that right. But Martin joins us from Pernod-Ricard, and he's the global head of advertising. So we wanted to use this episode to really talk about some of the really exciting campaigns that are involving influencers, how effective they've been. So more about that in a moment. But to start with, Martin, perhaps tell us a little bit about what you do in your role.
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, obviously I work at Pernod-Ricard, but specifically I work in our Scotch whisky business. So and one of the brands that I specifically work on is Chivas Regal. So it's one of our blended Scotch whiskies, kind of premium whiskey in our portfolio. And we have a portfolio that ranges from a 12-year-old product through to 25 and then a few non-age statements. But from a pricing perspective, you're talking anywhere from about kind of $40 for the entry point up to about $3,500 at the top end of the range, and obviously everything in between. So, Chivas has been around for about over 100 years. Our brand home is up in our distillery up in Scotland in Strathyler. And we're one of the kind of, I suppose, within the group of Pernod, we're one of the truly kind of global brands where we don't have necessarily just really kind of a foothold here or here. We are kind of represented in probably over about 150 countries.
That's great.
So there isn't really many places that you could go and not necessarily find Chivas Regal.
No, that's amazing. And so how when did you start to think about using content creators?
So basically, I've been using kind of influencers, content creators even before I came into the company. My background predominantly is automotive, and then obviously the last brand that I worked on in the automotive world was Aston Martin. So we used kind of influencers both at a kind of PR level, but also kind of just in terms of like events, experiential, and also through social. So when I came into Chivas, really I was coming in with that kind of background to try and move into a world that wasn't necessarily the traditional whiskey world of traditional advertising, traditional kind of look and feel. So we really just started to play around with things, and we were given quite good flexibility. And we then started, working with kind of influencers or content creators directly, but also working with some agencies. And what we really started to do was kind of build, I suppose, a bit of a rhythm more than anything else in context of who we thought was good for the brand, who was actually great at content, but necessarily didn't give us the social reach or the social influence that we were looking for. And like I say, some projects were very much around that. They were campaign driven, and we would say, we've got a budget of X. We would go to an agency and we would just say, right, we want 5 creators and we need them to deliver X, Y, and Z. And we'd work that way. On some other things, which we kind of did over the last kind of 2 or 3 years. One was with the amateur mixologist. We built up quite a good relationship directly, and we would do regular kind of ad hoc projects where we would ultimately just commission him directly. And some he would just be creating content off his own back, or some actually we would be booking out kind of a location or a studio, or even we went up to Strathyler, the distillery, and did a variety of kind of content there as well. So we really kind of, I suppose, had a bit of a hybrid approach to how we went about it.
And so let's talk about something more specific then, maybe more one of your best campaigns. And you mentioned, mixology as well, and actually having somebody that's a real specialist in this field. But perhaps you can be more specific about a campaign that you've run more recently.
Yeah, probably the last campaign, ironically, that we were working on with the amateur mixologist was actually also we were partnering with a chef. So we wanted to try and mix food and whiskey, but not in the kind of, I suppose, the traditional way that it's been done in the past. And traditionally in the past, it's very much whiskey and maybe charcuterie or cheese, etc., etc. And we were like, well, it's not really that exciting. So we wanted to kind of mix it up a bit. So we worked with, obviously, Matt, who's the amateur mixologist, but also a former Great British Bake Off contestant, Selassie, who's actually a chef as well. And weirdly, they already had a relationship. And actually, at the time, Selassie's flat was right next door to our office. So it worked out brilliantly for us because we'd get free cakes, which was nice when they were delivered. But yeah, so we actually were shooting this time last year, literally days before we went into lockdown in the UK, which was quite a weird experience. But we decided to get them to pair up kind of cocktails versus kind of almost like puddings and desserts. So obviously Selassie was creating certain kind of flavors based on the cocktails that Matt was making, but also in terms of the age statements of the whiskies associated. Because what we really wanted to do was, we were very much about creating at-home drinking content anyway, and that was even before we knew a pandemic was coming and that everyone was going to be spending so much time at home. We'd already, over the last kind of 18 months, 2 years, had started to recognize a trend that actually, if you're buying a certain type of product, you're more likely to probably drink it at home and maybe share it with friends. So we were trying to then kind of build on the emphasis of, well, you can just drink it neat, or you can drink it obviously as a highball, which is kind of whiskey and soda. Or if you want to be a little bit more creative, there are some interesting cocktails that you can do that even just on the cocktail side might include chocolate or other bits and pieces before you then even take into account what Selassie was bringing to the party, which was then maybe some truffles that he created, but also a whiskey bar recipe. There was a variety of different things. So really the content was shot in a home. So to make it look like, you could do this at home sort of thing. And the two of them working together in a kitchen. I mean, the crazy thing about it was literally it was the week or the weekend before we pretty much went into lockdown in the UK. So when we finalized the content, we couldn't actually release it because of the proximity of how close they were and,
Wow.
kind of the touching of certain things or even the tasting of certain things. So even though we'd finished the content, it was ready to go in essence for Easter because that was our original plan. We didn't actually get to release it probably until kind of July because we were conscious of everything that was kind of going on in the world. So still very successful, but not how we wanted it to be. And I suppose the nice thing about all of this content that we've created, it lives on afterwards. It's not just then, put out on social and it kind of just, you forget about it, or it's on Instagram stories and 24 hours later it's gone. What we tried to do is almost kind of create a longer form piece of content that could then live on our website, but also YouTube as well.
That's really, really interesting. And so tell us about the level of engagement that you had, that these creators had with their audiences, and how were you able to measure that?
So obviously we put certain paid media behind some of the posts as well. And obviously as part of the fee that we would have naturally paid, there is obviously the post that they put out themselves. I mean, in context, they have very different styles of audiences as well. I mean, Matt is very well recognized in that kind of mixology space, but he's still an amateur. He's not a bartender. So I think even now he's probably at like 35, 40,000 followers. But weirdly, actually, the majority of his audience is actually based in the US, even though he's UK based. Whereas Selassie's got kind of a few 100,000 followers, but obviously that's come off the back of his kind of, I suppose, fame in essence of the Great British Bake Off, and it's very much around baking, and he does other kind of brand associations. So it was mixed, but really what we tried to do in terms of what we saw as kind of results or success of the campaign was really more about how people, I suppose, engage with the content in terms of how much they've watched it. So we were really looking at, yes, obviously it's great to see that it reached X amount of people, or X amount of people actually clicked through to the video. But where we were at really was more the fact of they were kind of 1.5 to 2 minute videos. How far did people get into that video, or how many people actually completed it? And actually, for us, what was really interesting was the fact that the majority of people, and I don't have the exact stats to hand, but the majority of the people actually pretty much watched the whole film and then actually went on to the next one as well. So we saw some great stats, and I'll try and pull some out so I can share them with you. But yeah, I mean, it was one of our better kind of successful campaigns, and also not a massive cost in comparison to how you might think of it, because we were using influencers, we're leveraging their audience, but ultimately they in essence were the talent for our film. as well. So it pretty much became kind of their fee plus production, rather than if we were trying to shoot the same level of content and then, you know, potential usage for models or talent, and then you've only got kind of 12 months to use it, and things like that. Actually, it works out really cost effective. And that's kind of the model that we try to employ and have done, I guess, for the last kind of 2 years, where we will just, ideally, if we want to do those bigger form projects, we will go direct. If it's more just kind of what I call not traditional, but kind of the more normal kind of influencer pieces, we'll work with an agency. And over the last couple of years, we've built a relationship with an agency called Whaler. So generally, if we're running those kind of bigger campaigns where we might want to say, actually, we want 10 or 15 kind of creators, and we want them to be based in the US, the UK, Mexico, wherever it may be, we'll let them kind of deal with it. And we know that we get a level of reporting, we get a level of kind of SLA and all those good sort of bits and pieces. And actually, we know that they've got a good abundance of people on their books. And I think this is, I guess, the problem that I've always found, or I think not necessarily the problem, but I think this is where people get stuck a little bit, is like, well, how do we choose influencers? How do we find influencers? And I think it needs to be, again, a bit of a hybrid approach. Like I say, for us, sometimes we will go on Instagram ourselves and just potentially just reach out through a DM and just contact that person directly, or we'll use an influencer agency, but it'll be to different scales. I mean, even when we started working with Whaler, we were purely there for using their audiences and the content. But actually, as we progressed our relationship, what we then turned it into was that we might have some people that we think their content's great, but actually they don't deliver necessarily on the engagement or the audience profile. But it doesn't stop them from creating content for us, which we then host on our own channels or share with our markets as well. So it's almost, we turned it into kind of a production piece rather than just an influencer piece.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that you say that, because there's been a growing demand for content creators that don't necessarily have huge reach, that create amazing content, but particularly photographers and videographers.
Exactly that. And what we noticed was that actually people like the style of content, regardless of necessarily they might follow that person or they don't have the biggest following, but the style of content is what's kind of key. Yeah. I mean, the last campaign that we did, literally, which we just ran a report recently, we did 14 creators across UK, US, Japan, and France, because we try and do different kind of markets, because obviously, even though we're based in the UK and we have a global reach, and we also then try and pilot certain things in certain markets as well, because of the way the organization is set up, there will be ultimately a brand team within market and with then the global brand team. So it's how you balance that as well. But because we're using the global social channels and the handles, we'll run these kind of campaigns. We'll obviously let the markets know, because you don't want there to be any kind of issues. But like I say, that last campaign was in those 4 markets. And again, I think we worked with 14 creators. And for us, what was really interesting was that we actually created 84 pieces of content just for the brand. So that means our markets, and we've got X amount of markets and want to leverage this content. But also it meant that that was on top of the 50 pieces of content that the influencers created for their channels.
Yeah, it's huge.
So all in all, it's like, great, we've got reach, but also we've got all this other content that lives on, because obviously we know that, you know, the influencers probably moved on to their next project or doing their own thing. Whereas for us, the markets then have the ability to use that content for another 12 or so months and leverage, potentially also because they're going to tag the influencer, leverage that audience that influencer's got and the influence as well.
No, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, did you find differences with the content in different countries? So, for example, is your brand being perceived differently in Japan, which I know is a big whiskey drinking, and of course in China is as well, isn't it? That eastern area. And I wondered if the different types of content that resonated.
Actually, what we did was we were more interested in the type of people that were creating the content, rather than serving necessarily content that we thought was, I suppose, right for the market, if that made sense.
Yeah.
What we tried to do was, and also what we're now moving is we're trying to move our kind of our audience moving forward anyway, and kind of expand the whiskey world to hopefully a younger audience. So what we wanted to do was almost target kind of creators that could embody the people that we'd ideally want to drink the product. And I think, you know, Japan's an interesting case because you argue that they've got an amazing kind of culture in terms of kind of, I suppose, street kind of culture and sneakers and things like that. But also it's a very conservative culture. So it was getting that balance right in terms of delivering content or having content created that still kind of comes across as contemporary, but also doesn't necessarily impact the work that maybe the market's doing locally as well. So that's why it's this interesting balance. I mean, like I say, the creators that actually we got in Japan were really very interesting, actually predominantly all female as well, not through kind of any specific kind of choice. It was just, you know, obviously you have various different options, and the content that came back from Japan was predominantly kind of female, but really kind of took us into a very interesting space. And some of it was longer form, some of it was kind of shorter form, but it was, you could see that it was kind of, I suppose, relatively edgy for Japan, but you kind of go then compare that to maybe some of the content we got out of the UK or even France, and there was still that big gap. But actually from a representation on our own channels, it was great because you saw different aspects and it still represented the Chivas brand in the right way.
Thing as well. I mean, one thing which I love about influencer marketing, it can help brands discover new audiences, new consumers, purely and simply by the type of content that's being shown that the brand hadn't even considered.
Exactly that. Exactly.
Who knows where a viral campaign could go because of the positioning of a video, or that it's got some form of catchy phrase. Do you have, presumably you have campaign hashtags, do you, that actually will lock in the Chivas brand?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally in the past, because our main kind of advertising campaign was Success is a Blend, which we ran for pretty much the kind of last 3 years. So on a hashtag perspective, we went with hashtag blended is better, because we didn't want, I've never really been a fan, or never really kind of understood, and I'm not knocking it, but I've never really understood the mechanic of, this is my strap line, so therefore I'm going to use it as my hashtag. It's like, yes, it makes sense, but also it's like, does it really work, sort of thing? And I've never really dug into it. It's just almost like a bit of a personal preference. But for me, blended is better was a lot stronger as a hashtag than Success is a Blend. And also I think it's the ability that maybe blended is better doesn't just necessarily relate back to us. There is the ability to maybe piggyback on other conversations as well. But kind of moving forward, we'll probably look to introduce 1 or 2 other hashtags. We don't overly use kind of hashtags. And I think it's, you know, it's the right thing to have branded hashtags. Obviously, you know, you can't always kind of own them. There might be you know, someone's kind of used them similarly in the past. But I think really where we probably need to maybe do a bit of a better job, and it's not necessarily a better job, maybe I kind of say, take a different tact, is how we engage with hashtags and enter conversations that we're not necessarily in the first place. It's great to have your own, but I think it's more important almost to understand what are the hashtags that we potentially should be looking into, and how do we use those moving forward, whether that's kind of on our branded content or organic content, so to speak, versus kind of even influencer content.
That's, yeah. I mean, what sort of platforms do you tend to work with? I mean, obviously it's a very visual product, isn't it? So one immediately thinks of Instagram, YouTube, and maybe Pinterest. I don't know, but I'm also thinking that there's a lot of people from a professional point of view who would also be on Twitter and LinkedIn that drink whiskey. And I just wondered if you'd extended anything further in those other networks.
Yeah, I mean, our core channels fundamentally are kind of Facebook and Instagram. But obviously we do, and you know, we're looking at YouTube in a different way now moving forward. So we've got a bit of a project in the team now in terms of how we take our YouTube presence forward, rather than just using it as a bit of like I suppose a library for content, and also just a video player for our website. But also with Twitter, traditionally we've used it, and it was before my time in the business. The Twitter account was set up to support one of our projects called Chivas Venture. And that was predominantly, we used it for that, which is a competition that we've run for kind of 6 or 7 years for social entrepreneurs. And it was $1 million competition. And every year we would choose X amount of winners and run a program both kind of regionally, but also then into a global final. So we really used the channel just predominantly for that. And you could argue that it made sense because of the type of audience. But actually, within the last 6 months, we've kind of rebranded it and just started to use it as a Chivas Regal channel rather than just a venture related channel. And obviously, we've seen kind of different results because obviously the audience was predominantly built on the information of, learning about the venture. So we've lost some audience, but obviously we've gained new audience, sort of thing. So like I say, we'll look to how we continue to grow that. But I think the kind of catch-22 with Twitter is I think it's still somewhere that you go for news or like updates on certain things. And from a brand perspective, there's only so much, especially in the whiskey world, even with some of the partnerships that we have, we're never going to be necessarily rolling out kind of updates on a kind of daily, hourly, etc. basis. So I think it will be a supporting channel just to see what we can do and explore. And obviously that's where I think there's the opportunity to find out what's going on in conversations. Twitter's great for that, but predominantly it will remain being kind of Instagram and then Facebook at a core. I mean, from a Facebook perspective, because of the way that obviously Facebook allows you to regionalize or give, market kind of access quite easily, we have a global versus market presence, but in total, I think it's just over 5 or 6 million audience, which is not bad considering for a kind of a whiskey brand. And then on Instagram, we're about 140,000 globally, which for me is a weird one because we've probably doubled that in the time that I've been at Chivas. But then I came from my last job when I was at Aston Martin, and I had a social media following across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook of roughly about 14 million people. So you kind of compare the numbers, but this is the thing when it comes to brands, I think as well. It's like, you've got a complete passion brand like Aston, and they don't sell that many cars. They sell probably about 4,000 cars a year, and yet they've got a social community of 15 million people.
That's aspirants. Those are Aston Martin aspirants.
It's exactly that. It's an aspirational thing. And then, for us, there's a level of aspiration at Chivas, but equally it's still, you're never going to get to that same level. So like I say, we've been fortunate enough that we've managed based on the content kind of that we've been producing, but also, like with any brand, the way that the algorithms work and the platforms grow as well, we've managed to grow our audience quite a lot. And we're one of the bigger kind of social presence within our own group, within Pernod-Ricard as well. And we're competing against some kind of big brands as well, because, you look at Absolute, one of the world's kind of best known vodkas, Jameson, one of the best known kind of Irish whiskies. And they're really kind of the only two that are kind of bigger than us. So we're actually, I would say, probably punching above our weight. And I think that's the other flip side as well. We don't really invest in media bar kind of influencer marketing as well at a kind of global level, because it's difficult, because which markets do you choose to target? You can't, you're never going to have a media budget big enough that you can spread it kind of globally. So we'll generally only do it on a very ad hoc basis, and that's where the influencers really do come in terms of more as a, you could argue, as a media buy, because you can target specific markets based on not necessarily even where they are, but just their audience profile and makeup.
And has your influencer marketing spend increased over time proportionally, even during lockdown? I mean, people tell me that it has, and they're going to invest a lot more in 2021.
I mean, it hasn't directly increased because we were already kind of on a path where we were looking to spend X amount anyway. Right. And also the way that we look at it is almost, we'll put an influencer pot together in essence of our budget planning every year, but also then we'll probably top that up because we'll consider it content. So as much as we might say, well, this is a pot for influencer marketing, we might then say, well, actually within our content, just kind of always on kind of content, we might take some money out of that. And also that's before you take any kind of supplementary campaigns into account, because obviously we have a partnership with Manchester United, so we might do certain things around activations with the club that might mean we use certain influencers, but that's more on, I suppose, on a PR activational kind of basis, so that comes from a slightly different pot as well. So it's always a tricky one when it comes to budget, because we probably spend more than the line item that stipulates for a kind of influencer marketing, but that's also the way, because obviously like with any business, you kind of need to report back where you're spending it, so it's easier to explain, well, this was content rather than me just paying someone to have fun on Instagram sort of thing.
Yeah. And then finally, what's your thoughts about live streaming? Because that's been a huge growth area, hasn't it? And
Yeah.
lots of brands being able to get that sort of immediate engagement with storytelling, education.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if the sort of live stream mixology is something that you are thinking about or going to be doing, and
We
other
we
things.
we certainly considered it. Our main thing really, and where I kind of, I suppose, I think you need to be very careful with live is to ensure you've got the quality. So I think, lockdown one in the UK was a prime example where a lot of kind of celebrities started doing lives on Instagram, whether it's just, two comedians who are having a chat, great. You know, people were ribbing them because one of them had a really terrible signal. I remember even Jamie Redknapp and Jack Whitehall were doing an Instagram live, and Jamie Redknapp's signal was awful, completely pixelated, kept cutting in and out, getting completely kind of like, shot down in the commentary, but people were happy to still watch it. I think the risk for a brand is, if you're going to do live, you still need to be able to control that quality, because people aren't going to forgive you as a brand for putting out, regardless of whether it's live or recorded content. They're still not going to forgive you if it's not very good quality, and the commentary is going to it's going to be shown in the commentary. So for me, there is a place for live, but I think you just need to be able to even know that if you're working with a brand ambassador that you may have, that they've got good enough quality at home if we're in lockdown kind of scenarios, that you can justify going out live. And I think this is where, certainly over the last 12 months, I've looked at certain things and gone, not sure I would have done that as the brand. But some brands also are, I suppose, in a different position where they might not necessarily be at a level where they think it's a risk. And, I'm a big fan of taking risks, but also there's weighing up against what type of brand. Yeah, exactly.
Risk, isn't there? Yeah.
There's measured risk, because ultimately, if you're considered a premium brand or a luxury brand or a brand of a certain stature, that still needs to reflect in how you represent yourself, regardless of whether it's kind of on social media, whether it's in TV advertising, whether it's out of home. You still have to have that level of quality, because someone's paying for your product and they want that experience. And whether that's the experience of the product or whether it's the experience of you on social or content, you need to marry the two together. And that's why what we decided to do was we created a lot of content that was still at home, but we didn't necessarily do it live. We worked with a number of bartenders around the world who had been part of our Chivas Masters, which is a bar kind of tender competition that we would run normally every year, but obviously hasn't been possible over the last kind of 12 or so months. But actually what we did was we went then back out to those guys who were all stuck at home in different parts of the world and created content with them about creating cocktails at home. But also, one guy might have been in Amsterdam, one guy might have been in Singapore, or we had a lady in Taiwan, I think. We had people all over the place. They would shoot it themselves, but from our perspective, we did an editing job over the top and then released it to ensure the quality was there. We were happy to pay for the content, and it was almost, an indirect way of kind of recognizing that bars were all shut. And, we were hoping that it was a level of contribution back to them as well, because they were stuck at home. But equally for us, it was a great content piece, but we would then put that into post-production and do a level of work, whether that was kind of sound or kind of editing or grade, just to make sure that it still looked like it came from the right place.
And I think you're right to do that, because although there's been a big trend in not overproduced content, anti-photoshopped,
Yes.
because people want to see authentic storytelling, don't they?
Yeah.
But there is also a point that you make, that when it comes to sort of sound quality and some of the other issues of picture grainy, they wouldn't expect that from a brand. So I think it makes absolute sense. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you today, and thank you so much for taking the time out. If people want to find more about Chivas, where can they find out more?
So chivas.com will take you to your local market site. Obviously, the site's optimized for that. Or check us out on Instagram, which is @Chivas Regal.
Super. Thank you ever so much, Martin.
Thanks a lot, Gordon. It's been great.